All right, so we've got quite a bit to get through today, so I might just get started and then people can join as we're going along. So, welcome everyone to our first Supporting Diverse Workforces session. My name is Sarah Walker and I'm the Sector Development Lead here at QCOS. And on the line, I've also got my colleagues Nina, Michael, and Marcia to assist me with delivering this webinar today. So, before we get into the content today, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm on today, the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, and pay my respect to elders past and present. QCOS thanks First Nations peoples for the gift of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and we're committed to walking alongside First Nations peoples and working towards representation, Makarrata, and treaty. I would also like to further extend my respect to any First Nations peoples joining us on the line today. And we also encourage you all to use the chat function to let us know which traditional lands you're all dialing from. So thank you so much for joining us today. So this first session is on how diversity and inclusion strategies come to life. And this series, Supporting Diverse Workforces, is a 5-part webinar series aimed at supporting community service organisations to develop their human resources capability. And the series will cover the many aspects of attracting, supporting, and retaining a diverse workforce. We'd like to thank the Department of Employment, Small Business and Training, who have funded this program through their Growing Workforce Participation Fund. So just some quick housekeeping before we jump in. So you will receive a post-event email after the session today, which will include the presentation slides, and you'll also receive access to an online resource library. And in terms of the format of the session today, we'll firstly be joined by Christine Mudavanu and Lisa Stockwell, who will be presenting information on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging strategies and the steps to creating these strategies. And then in the second half of the session today, we'll be joined by a number of panelists who will share their own experiences in relation to implementing diversity and inclusion strategies into their organisations. And they'll be highlighting some of their key learnings and key factors that have led to success. So to kick things off, I'd like to welcome Christine from Utano Global and Lisa from Kanban HR Consulting to deliver the first part of the session. So just to give you some background into Lisa and Christine, Christine is the principal consultant of Utano Global, a diversity, equity and inclusion consulting firm, and she's also the director for Queensland at Migrant Women in Business. Which is a national social enterprise supporting entrepreneurial migrant and refugee women. Christine champions human transformation by fostering inclusive cultures within organisations. And Lisa Stockwell is the principal consultant of Kanban HR Consulting and is the lead facilitator of a boutique diversity, equity and inclusion training and consulting company. Lisa's got more than 25 years of experience and is driven by the importance of diversity, equity and inclusion to enable both leaders and team members to provide the best service to their clients. So I'll hand over now to you, Christine and Lisa, to kick us off. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Can everybody hear me? Excellent. All right. So I'd like to start by just giving you a quick session outline of what myself and Lisa are going to run you through in the next half an hour or so. We'll give you a quick overview of the community services sector. We'll delve a little bit into what diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging actually is. We'll talk to you about how you can run your own organizational diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging audits, which helps you to set a baseline because it is important to know where you are in order for you to project where you would like to go. Then we'll talk to you about what makes a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy successful. So the community services sector. I want to start by providing you a quick overview of the community services sector in which you all work. The community services sector is a big deal. If the general population didn't realize this already, it certainly became obvious during the pandemic. Society grinds to a halt without you and the astounding work that you do, which isn't surprising given the size of the sector, which is often oblivious to the average member of the public. It is the largest employing sector in Queensland and is rapidly growing. In fact, the industry is expected to account for 1/3 of all Australian jobs growth over the next 5 years. The fastest growth is projected to be in the area of hospital, social services assistance, and residential care services. It does have an interesting workforce composition. I'm sure, as many of you are aware, it's heavily female dominated with high levels of part-time and casual employment and a number of overseas trained employees. According to the Community Services Sector Industry Alliance, healthcare and social assistance have been the largest employing industry in Queensland for over a decade. And in 2020, the industry represents 14% of Queensland's total workforce. And you can see those statistics on that slide. The sector has a number of advantages in the sense that you already represent a diverse footprint, but what does that look like from your workforce? There is opportunity for growth. The sector could do a bit more in terms of employing people with a disability, increasing opportunities for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people and people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. The sector is already doing really well in terms of women leadership, and that's attributed by and large to the Queensland Government's commitment to reach 50% gender parity on all boards, of which that includes the NGO sector, which is an ancillary arm of government.
It also has some unique HR issues. Caring roles are historically undervalued and therefore underfunded, and that of course can lead to job insecurity, limited career pathways, low pay rates and high underemployment. When I looked on Seek this week at job ads in the community services sector, just about every one of them seemed to be a casual or a fixed term role. The client base of the community services sector is typically comprised of some of the most marginalised and vulnerable members of our community. And while some employees in this sector bring with them their own lived experience, the majority of employees don't reflect the diversity that we see in the client base. And the decision makers in our organisations are even less reflective of this community. This means we often see a real disconnect between the policies and the services offered and what is needed by either staff or the clients. As an example, a survey done into the New South Wales community services sector showed that only half of its member organisations had an employee policy regarding support for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Only 43% had an employee policy in place for cultural and linguistically diverse people, and only a third had a policy for people with disabilities. And yet these are the very groups of people that these organisations are supporting externally as their clients. So we know as an industry you have some challenges in winning the talent war, but you also have access to real-time lived experience data. You're on the ground, so to speak, day in, day out, supporting and enabling our most vulnerable, most marginalised sections of our community. So how can you take these learnings and turn them inwards to become an employer of choice? Building a great organisation takes time and effort. So today we'll start by briefly exploring what we mean by diversity, equity, inclusion and belonging before we look at what's needed for some strategies in this space. And then of course we'll have some amazing examples of DEI strategy with our expert panel.
This is a very fast recap on some key terminologies that you may be already aware of. Diversity refers to the mix of people in an organization, the difference between people in how they identify in relation to their social identity, their professional identity. Social identity dimensions can be internal or external dimensions, with the internal dimensions typically being the least likely dimensions to change. Each of these dimensions is different for every one of us, and they come together in a unique way to shape the way we view and perceive the world and how others perceive us. Equity. While often used interchangeably, equity and equality mean different things and lead to different results. When we treat everyone equal, equity, we treat everyone the same. And when we treat everyone equitably, we focus on the individualistic needs. In a diverse workforce, differences exist and people require support in different ways. Equity asks us to acknowledge that everyone has different needs and experiences and opportunity, and that not everyone is starting from the same point because of this. Inclusion refers to getting the diverse mix of people in an organization to work together to improve performance and well-being. This only happens when people feel respected, valued, connected to their colleagues, and progressing in their career. Inclusion happens in two ways: social inclusion, cognitive inclusion. Social inclusion is the act of physically representing or informing someone, for example, including someone in the right email and the right meeting. Cognitive inclusion is the act of valuing someone's contribution, point of view, ideas, and believing it will add value to the quality of the conversation or the decision. Belonging is the feeling of security, support, when there is a sense of acceptance, inclusion, and identity for a member of a certain group. It is when an individual can bring their authentic self to work. Belonging is the ultimate panacea. It is when it is obvious that people are explicitly making sure that their voices are valued. Inclusion is being in the same room and having the opportunity to have the conversation.
For your DEI strategy to be effective, however, it needs to be more than just diversity. People need to feel psychologically safe to voice their opinions and be involved in decision making. Employees who have a strong sense of belonging compared to employees with a low sense of belonging demonstrate a 50% reduction in turnover risk, a 56% increase in performance, and a 75% decrease in employee sick days. Workers in inclusive teams are also 6 times more likely to report that work had a positive impact on their mental health. Furthermore, when employees feel like they belong, they are 167% more likely to recommend their organisation as a great place to work. Engaged employees outperform disengaged employees on every measured dimension. When comparing employee engagement levels, Gallup, who runs international surveys in this space for absolute decades and decades, they have found that top and bottom quartile business units and teams had some of these differences in their business outcomes. An 81% difference in absenteeism, a 58% difference in patient safety incidents. So mortality rates and falls, for example, 58% lower when those patients are being looked after by a highly engaged team. A 64% reduction in safety incidents, and a 10% increase in customer loyalty and engagement. I mean, these are huge, huge impacts. Can you imagine how much less time you'd be spending recruiting, for example, if you had that sort of outcome? Leading Australian psychologist Dr. Peter Cotton found that more than 50% of our wellbeing at work can be attributed to the quality of our relationship with our line manager. In fact, supportive leadership factors and the quality of team-based climate regularly explains about 30% of the variance in bottom line financial or service delivery. If you've worked in a diverse team, you'll know it can feel clunky, it can feel slow. But because a more diverse team brings diverse perspectives, different ideas, and questions the status quo, simply because the status quo isn't their version of reality, they end up making better decisions. More diverse teams actually have better social intelligence. So they have less groupthink, better collaboration, and approximately 40% of that team performance can actually be attributed back to that social intelligence. So what is it that we need for our strategies to be successful in this space? Okay. So we need to make sure our employee group is reflective of our community. We need to make sure that we have good leadership commitment to this. We obviously need to make sure that we understand what the legislative considerations are in this space, and then make sure our organisational structure and our business strategy, KPIs, actually link back to what we're looking for as well. There's no point in having a DEI strategy that is unrelated to your business strategy. We then need to have a couple of things that you might think are a little bit unusual. We need to have curiosity. We need to actually be able to listen to what people are telling us, and we need to have empathy. None of us have experience with what other people are going through, so we need to ask them, what is it that's important for them? And we'll have a look at each of these in turn.
Steps to developing your diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging strategy. The first and the most fundamental step is you need to gain leadership commitment. You need to conduct a diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging audit to assess your benchmark. You need to know where you're starting from. Review your organization's policies and procedures and how they align to some of the objectives and what you're trying to achieve. Identify areas of strengthening and determine reasonable key performance indicators. Develop a process for regularly reviewing the strategy and keeping leadership accountable to the agreed KPIs. There's nothing worse than having a brilliant diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging strategy that just gathers dust and sits on the shelf and looks nothing like what the organization is actually doing. Strengths and challenges for the sector when implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some of the strengths are there's continuous growth, regardless of what technology might do for the sector. There's a huge growth in the for-purpose businesses, including the exponential growth of social enterprises. People are reaching that self-actualization stage where they want to invest in businesses that are having impact. This puts the community services sector in a unique position of strength. No other industry provides the same breadth and depth of services. But there are some challenges. While nearly 70% of people in the workforce have some post-secondary qualifications, there are no minimum standards that are mandatory and administered by an accredited body, such as what the health sector has with APRA, for example. This makes the workforce vulnerable as the bar of entry is low and vulnerable groups are a large component of the frontline workforce. And they are also not reflective in the decision-making of the organization. There's also things like legacy ties to government funding and traditional religious institutional funding. The critical components of a successful DEI strategy: sponsorship of implementing DEIB initiatives. If you don't have investment behind your strategies, again, they just sit on a shelf. The community services sector is one sector that is on a trajectory to be on continuous growth, regardless of what technology might do. The mirroring of the workforce to the customer base and leadership has been a long-held tension, and one that can be addressed through your work, through your diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. There are a lot of hidden opportunities that could provide the sector with increased advantages, such as migrant workforce and disability workforce, increased adoption of place-based community-driven responses. This was most seen with the pandemic. Population trends. In Australia, it's no secret that we have an aging population, which means more services from your sector will be required. The hidden opportunities that are missed for the community services sector is predominantly in the disability workforce, where 15 to 24 people in the sector are likely to be underemployed when it comes to the disability workforce. Population trends and the sector demanding more work for our aging population.
We'll have a look now at what we need to do for the audit. But before you start the audit, you really need to ask yourself some key questions. Like, why are you doing this in the first place? What do you actually hope to achieve with the data? Have a look at what data you already have that you can repurpose. How are you going to make sure that the data you do collect is going to be confidential? It's going to be accurate. How are you going to be reporting it back? Will you be benchmarking it? These are all really important things that you need to consider before you even start the journey. There's a couple of different areas that you need to be looking at. It's not just about the staff. You need to also consider what your stakeholders are, your employment policies and practices. Look at your recruitment processes, your recruitment data. What is your remuneration and reward policy? How does that actually work? Have you done a gender pay equity gap, for example? And of course, looking at what inclusive practices you have, learning and development is also really important to consider. It's important to measure the degree and the breadth of your culturally diverse talent in your leadership team, your workforce, customer base, and the labour market pool. This enables organisations to assess how well their current workforce and leadership team supports the markets and the clients that you serve. Employees new to your organisation really need to understand that the census data collected by payroll upon their commencement is confidential data and that it's not shared back with their manager in any way. As such, it's important that this is shared with them as soon as they start, so that way they feel safe to disclose any relevant information. I just want to draw your attention to two particular points on the slide there. The second one, remember, identity is key. Groupings that are too broad are meaningless. So, for example, if you're looking at, where people are from, having a grouping option of, say, Africa or Asia, it's too broad to give you any real meaning. But groupings that are too small are equally useless. So if you are a small organisation, we actually recommend that you use a focus group rather than a survey to capture this information. And finally, with that last point, point 6, engaging with intersectionality. It's important to remember that most people will actually identify with more than just one diversity dimension. So how do you capture meaningful data for employees who identify as a member of a number of underrepresented groups? For example, you might have someone who is gay, is female, and was born in Indonesia. How are you going to capture all of those different elements? The Diversity Council of Australia has a fantastic audit tool that I would strongly recommend that you use if you're looking at doing it yourself.
An analysis of client and community diversity will help you to identify gaps within the diversity representation in your organization. It also helps you to understand what resources and community groups are available to support your DEIB initiatives. Who are you selling your services to? What communities are you working with? For example, it is estimated that approximately 2/3 of consumer wealth will be controlled by women by 2026. More than 4 million Australians over the age of 65 and more than 1/4 of Australians speak a language other than English. This is a core customer base for yourself. So it is important to understand your client base and the diversity of the community that you serve.
Oops.
So organizational structure, business strategy, and KPIs. The first point here is the most important one. You can't focus on everything. Celebrating 53 different diversity days with cupcakes is often meaningless. When you have a diversity, equity, and inclusion belonging, what is it showing you are the most important areas to focus on? Like every organization, you have a finite set of resources. So DEI strategies fail if they're not central to the purpose of the organizations. Line managers are not accountable. Queensland public sector targets will flow through to the community services sector via supplier contracts. So women in leadership, we talked about that earlier, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples, people with a disability, people from non-English speaking backgrounds. So by and large, some of your KPIs may be externally driven, but you need to make sure that these correlate to where your organization is going and the direction you are taking. Leadership commitment. Without leadership commitment, you go nowhere. So leadership, there are consequences for leaders falling in to meet their obligations to address harassment, of where they are found to engage in harassment. It's clearly outlined in governance documents. Do leaders model safe and respectful and inclusive language and conduct? How your leaders conduct yourself within your organization is also reflective of your commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Do senior recruitment positions and promotions follow a criteria on role modeling and fostering a safe, inclusive environment? Do leaders' performance agreements and contracts specify conduct expectations? Are there appropriate resources to process and manage and report on? And most importantly, are there consequences? Leadership and commitment equals HR responsibility. So what does leadership in action look like? In 2023, a FIFO iron ore in a remote Western Australian community was recognised for achieving a gender-balanced workforce, which it considered to be at least 40% male or female, and an equal balance of power and influence. What makes this all the more remarkable is that in the same month, a case study was published. One of the former employees was jailed for sexually assaulting an unconscious female employee in November 2020. Since then, BHP has made decisive actions to change the culture of the mine. There was strong engagement from senior leadership who have a strict gender equity target. Strong support from leaders in head office, major investment in fostering and welcoming Safe Mind Camp, use of science and data-driven approaches to drive change, and recognition that gender equality is hard to achieve and sustain and requires ongoing work. If a small mine in Western Australia, which is heavily dominated, can achieve and have such great results, what more can you do in the community services sector?
The next thing we're going to look at is the legislative considerations. Employers now have a positive duty to take reasonable and proportionate action to eliminate and respond to sex discrimination, sexual harassment, and victimisation in the workplace. It's no longer just enough to respond to sexual harassment, discrimination, or victimisation. You actually need to proactively prevent it from happening. The recent changes to the Work Health and Safety Act also mean that employers have a positive duty to take reasonable and proportionate action to eliminate, or as far as practicable, minimise psychosocial hazards in the workplace. And this includes from clients and other third parties. Sexual harassment and psychosocial hazards are now explicitly considered work health and safety hazards. So just like you would consult with team members and implement a risk assessment matrix and then apply a hierarchy of controls for a potential physical risk, you now have that same legal obligation to do this for sexual harassment and other psychosocial hazards. This means if you're a manager or you're running a business, you have a legal responsibility to ensure that psychosocial hazards at work are effectively managed. And there are a lot of things in the diversity, equity, inclusion space that, when not handled well, are considered psychosocial hazards. A key aspect of these legislative requirements is the new Respect at Work legislation. You need to be taking action in all 7 of these areas to demonstrate that you are preventing and responding to sexual harassment and discrimination. And please don't for a moment think, well, we haven't had any of those sort of complaints, so we don't need to do anything. Most cases of sexual harassment go unreported. While this might seem like a lot of work, the good news is you can actually use this same framework to apply to all of your diversity dimensions. So you really do get better bang for your buck. The final things you need are curiosity, an ability to listen, and empathy. You need to be curious about why people do what they do, what it is they need to thrive, or at least compete on an equal footing. And you need to listen to what you're actually told, and you need to have empathy. Focus groups, qualitative survey results, ideally conducted by a third party, will help to give you the information that you need. If you're large enough, consulting with your employee resource groups on proposed policy changes will also let you know if the policies are inadvertently disadvantaging some groups more than others. So take your family and domestic violence policy as an example. You may have a gay male employee who is experiencing domestic violence, maybe a non-binary person experiencing domestic violence, or a person experiencing intergenerational coercive control. If your family and domestic violence policy doesn't contain the language or the examples that allows these employees to identify themselves in this policy, to believe that this policy applies as much to them as it does to the Anglo woman married to an abusive husband, then you don't have an inclusive family and domestic violence policy. You might have diversity within your employee group, but you don't have inclusion, and you certainly don't have a sense of belonging. Now take that same lens and apply it to your sexual harassment policy, your leave policy, your remuneration policy, your learning and development policy. You get my drift. It's also important just to note that the best practice recommendation from the Respect at Work Act is to have a standalone sexual harassment and sex discrimination policy. Don't just roll it in to your broader harassment and discrimination policy. There's a few things to think about with this slide, but I just want to focus on the first two. Recruitment. To be capturing meaningful recruitment data, you need to be gathering it as soon as candidates are applying. But what it doesn't capture is who is not applying. Perhaps they're from a low socioeconomic background, or they're a refugee and they only have access to a phone, not a computer. Can they apply to your job just by using the phone? Perhaps they have dyslexia or vision impairment. Again, how easy is it for them to apply? Can your ad and your recruitment process and website be comfortably navigated by using a screen reader? Does your ad imply that you're looking for a unicorn because you've got 27 exceptional attributes listed in your ad? Just calm the farm and identify the top 5. It's not a shopping list. And the last time I checked, we do have a talent shortage for everything from baristas to barristers. Offer reasonable accommodations. Say that they're available and just ask. We can help. The next session that we'll be running is actually on writing position descriptions and job ads, and session 3 is on recruitment. So we'll actually explore this a bit more later on. The second one I want to look at is promotion. Now, there's a lot of moving parts that go into getting promoted. Organisations will always say things like, our decisions are based on merit. However, let me share with you 3 statistics that might change your mind. The first one is in relation to office housework. Now, if you haven't heard of the term office housework, think of all of those things that happen at work that's not actually part of your job description. Who's looking after the new person who's just turned up? Who's organising the annual leave roster over the Christmas break? Who's organised that the cake is going to be there for Mary's birthday morning tea next week? Who's getting things ready for the meeting that's running tomorrow, or taking the minutes for the meeting as it's happening? These are all things that are considered office housework. Now, the funny thing is, when women choose not to do these tasks, they're actually penalised for it. Whereas if men, stay late to help prepare for a meeting or help out with other tasks, they receive an average 14% increase in their performance ratings. And these findings have been replicated across the private and the public sectors and across a wide range of roles, with the analysis showing that the median woman spends more than 200 hours on non-promotable work each year compared to the median man. 200 hours is about a month of work doing work that is not rewarded. It's not in your job description. Team meeting interruptions. Now, women are on average are interrupted women are 3 times more likely to be interrupted than men in meetings, and their ideas are quite often appropriated by others. Now, when a person's ideas aren't heard, it can be harder for them to be perceived as a key contributor, which in turn can harm their career progression. Research has found that male executives who speak more often than their peers are actually considered more competent by 10%, while female executives who speak up are considered less competent by 14%. Frequent interruptions can also be read as a sign that the interrupter believes that their status is higher than the person being interrupted. In terms of performance review criteria, researchers have repeatedly found that women and people of colour are held to a higher standard of performance, and when performance criteria are unclear, evaluators actually shift the criteria around to favour the male applicants over a female one. Further, we tend to hire or promote women based on their past performance and hire men based on their future potential. Two Harvard Business Review studies also found that women are nearly 50% more likely than men to receive critical subjective feedback, as opposed to objective feedback that might actually be tied to business outcomes.
Just to round that off, there are some common diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging strategy pitfalls. And with those, you see that not reviewing and amending your employment policies, having no leadership commitments, and not listening to the employee or your service users or your community, not doing internal work and staff to ensure that the organization is well prepared to support staff. Now, we have a fun visual representation there of what a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy that is successful looks like and what one isn't. The bottom one, as you can see with our hedgehog, they only have one set of spikes in there, taking into account one set of binary indicators, whereas the one above is the one that we're all aiming for, which is the panacea, and it's focused on inclusion, not just diversity. To end off, I'd like to leave you with a quote from Lisa Anise from the Diversity Council of Australia. Organizations mistakenly assume that the best way to be equitable and inclusive is to treat everyone the same, when in fact, the best way to be equitable and inclusive is to treat people fairly. And sometimes that requires treating some people differently to others. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Lisa and Christine, for guiding us through the ins and outs on how to make a diversity and inclusion strategy come to life. If anyone has any questions for Lisa and Christine about the content, please feel free to pop it in the chat, and they'll be looking at the chat and will be able to answer those. So now I'm going to move on to our panel part of the session. And as you can see on the screen, we have 5 wonderful panelists joining us today. So I'll just give an introduction of each of our panelists. So our first panelist, Ryan Ray, is from Uniting Care. So Ryan is a senior leader in organisational development and employee experience with Uniting Care Queensland. Ryan has a background in psychology and 15 years experience in the health and community services sector, and his passion and leadership has created rich and celebrated inclusion programs. We've also got Susie Hullick joining us. So Susie is the Group Head of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion with the Westpac Group, which has seen her lead a national approach providing strategic direction to a more equitable workforce. Susie's accomplishments include establishing the Indigenous Employment Program, which saw her recognised as a Westpac Women of Influence. We've also got Jed Shields joining us today. Jed is a social worker by training and has worked in public healthcare for over 10 years. Jed currently leads the diversity and inclusion team at Gold Coast Health, demonstrating a commitment to diversity and inclusion led by his own lived experiences and a fundamental belief in social justice. We've also got Karen Wharton joining us, and Karen is from DESBIT, so the Department of Employment, Small Business and Training. Karen has over 25 years of experience in public policy, working across the Queensland Government, and her current role is the Director of Strategic Policy with DESBIT. And this has included Karen leading the development and implementation of key initiatives to support closing the gap in training and employment and assisting Indigenous small businesses. And finally, we've got Annette Schoon joining us. And Annette is a colleague of ours at QCOS. Annette is the Executive Director of Operations here at QCOS and is also a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, holding qualifications in human resources, community service management, community development, and project management. So to kick us off, I might start with you, Ryan. And you've been heavily involved in Uniting Care's diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging journey over the past decade. Are you able to walk us through some of the diversity and inclusion strategies that Uniting Care has implemented and provide some advice on how organisations can start their DEIB journey?
Yeah, sure thing, Sarah. Thank you for having me along. It's very exciting and great to have a nice little refresher at the start there. Look, D&I for us started very organically, very small, and has been and will be for everybody, I'm sure, a long haul journey. As with a lot of organizations, ours actually started very simply about 12 years ago with us embarking on creating our very first reconciliation action plan. And that was really, really quite simple at its time. It was really around strategies of things like First Nations traineeships, having targeted recruitment efforts to increase representation in our workforce, and a lot of symbolism such as artwork, email signatures, all that quite strong, but simple symbolism and what that did. But for us, though, I'm actually not going to talk too much about the wrap, and I'm going to focus on some of the other areas that we have really focused on. For us, it actually really stayed as just the wrap for a really long time, and where we had a great First Nations focus and we had dedicated funding around that, but we did nothing else in this space. So that actually changed about 6 years ago. When we internally to our people and culture function made a pledge that we really needed to have a focus on D&I, and I was given that portfolio in the organisation. What we really did there is we recognised that out of our workforce, what kind of communities we were really going to focus on and what unique strategies or goals did each one of those communities need to have, because really recognizing that they are not all equal in terms of what they need to achieve or what their primary focuses needed to be. So how that kind of really played out, for example, was for people with disability. It was around how are we to ensure our recruitment practices are accessible? How do we ensure that we are able to really reduce things like unconscious bias in our leaders? How are we able to really increase their employment representation in our organisation? For LGBTQ people and communities, it was really around, quite simply, having visible inclusion. It was about creating awareness that, hey, guess what? We work here too. And really breaking down the barriers to working for a church-based organisation. What had to be a real big focus in that space, because there was absolutely reticence around, can I work here? Am I welcome here? Am I included here? And am I represented here? So for that community, it was really around ensuring that LGBTQ people felt seen, felt heard, and felt included. That became actually really real at the time. We were doing a lot of this during the infamous marriage equality postal debacle, and the biggest thing that we did at that time was, and quite frankly, the very first time this organisation even mentioned the acronym LGBTQ or any of its variations, was to actually acknowledge it through a CEO comms. So it was kind of like our big bursting out, if you will, of the proverbial closet by our CEO sending out in her newsletter a public acknowledgement potentially feeling and going through during that postal vote. And so that was really around, and look, the first comms was pretty low key. It was certainly straddling some lines, but it was acknowledgement. And then, we had the positive postal vote, and we had the second comms, and that was actually, our CEO and our ELT for the very first time saying, we stand with this decision of the Australian people. and the impact that had on this organization and on visibility cannot be underestimated. And for our culturally and linguistically diverse communities, which is actually by far our largest represented community across our organisation. So for context, we work in aged care, disability services, lifeline, retail, counselling services, and hospitals. So our multicultural aspect is very strong. But it was actually about awareness. It was about cultural sensitivity and maturity and being culturally aware and accepting of people. So you can see how all those different communities actually had to have very different focuses. Some of these areas started out really small, literally about, like I mentioned before, having an email about important days and using our resources or free resources wherever we could. Something that we did it was great to hear the team talking earlier about kind of like self-assessments and that sort of thing. So something that we did quite early because we had very, very little funding. We had myself who had it as a portfolio on top of a couple of other org development portfolios. But we knew we had some in-principle support from our ELT. So we really just went pillaging around whatever free resources we could find and whatever we could do on a really low-key basis that actually would have an impact. So something we did for both our multicultural space and also the LGBTQ was we read through the D&I aged care action plans that have been put out by the Department of Health and Ageing. And what we did there, so that's around some action plans that the department have put out as their expectations on providers. So we read through them and we took a lot of the foundational actions from the action plans and we actually put them into a self-assessment checklist. And so we promoted those self-assessment checklists to our services. So we have about 250 individual sites across Queensland. So we promoted them. We connected them to the customer really strongly to go, these are action plans. They are optional action plans put out by the department, but this is how you can actually make your customers and by connection, your employees feel more included here. And so they were really sort of, a basic self-assessment to go through against what was expected by the department anyway. It helps with your accreditation standards. And also, really importantly, you have a self-built action plan. If you don't tick those boxes on the self-assessment, you know that that's an opportunity for you to explore. What we did was we ran some really cool kind of promotional campaigns around it. So, for example, if you completed the LGBTQ self-assessment form and you sent it into a inbox that we had, then we awarded you, and I'll show you over here, we awarded you with a really cool plaque that you could put on your wall in your, entry foyer to your aged care facility, something around everyone is welcome here at Uniting Care. So just kind of that sort of thing by promoting at a very low cost around ensuring that our services were trying to be and assess themselves on how they can be more inclusive. For some other sorts of things that we did, we went bigger. So we launched an LGBTQ ally program, for example, and with that we really just, the start of that was about creating a couple of principles on a page on what it means to be an ally. We connected with a couple of, friendly senior leaders who were prepared to get on board and get behind it, purely using relationships of, tea-based conversations of, hey, I know you're supportive. Are you willing to do this? Are you willing to stand up and talk about it and actually walk the talk? And they were just like, yep, count me in. And so what we did there was we went big bang with the launch of our ally program. We organised we booked out a cinema in Brisbane and we organised a film screening of a documentary that was LGBTQ themed. And for anyone who kind of goes, geez, like that sounds a lot of work. It's actually much easier to book out a cinema screening, let me tell you. I'd never done it before, but it's pretty easy. And we actually sold tickets. So it was a completely cost neutral way to go about something that was really big, really symbolic, and actually got people really involved. So even though we only had 5 allies on board at the start of that, and we end up having about 200 people from across Brisbane attend the screening. And it wasn't just corporate people, it was people out in our services who heard about it, who booked tickets and who came along and were really engaged through that process. So something really wonderful there. Just conscious I've probably spoken already too much, but in some of the other spaces, we really partnered with a disability employment provider to focus on what we could do in the disability space. So recognizing we didn't have the internal expertise there. So we partnered with a disability provider who had reaches all across Queensland, where our recruitment team could really partner with them on what are our jobs, help us review our processes, help us review our application processes, and to ensure that we're asking the right questions around accessibility, that we're designing our job ads to the examples that were spoken about before. Through that as well, we were able to introduce a disability internship program. So this was actually something really cool that we run in our 4 hospitals, which was about accessing NDIS funding for school leavers who had disability. And so what they were able to do is to transition them from leaving school and entering the workforce. We had a 12-month internship program that we designed with external experts free of charge, to really kind of help create something of how do these school-based trainee or school leaver trainees bridge the gap to get to employment. And so it was really around how do we support them through job coaching, for example. How do they learn working in a hospital environment as an admin officer or a clerk or whatever it might be, to develop their own skills so that they're employable into the future. So that's something that we've done that has been a huge success at Uniting Care. Just lastly, we have also introduced, looking at our policies, right? That has already been spoken to. It's such an easy first run off the map of making sure you've got really inclusive policies. Look at your parental leave, for example, and look at the sorts of terms that you might be using through your parental leave around mother and father, for example, or partner leave, and etc. We've really ensured that we have introduced things like gender affirmation leave, which provides people with leave to affirm their gender. Now, that's actually something that's actually very low cost to do. It's a small portion, a small but hugely marginalized portion of the community, and so the actual cost to the business is not significant, but the symbolism of that is enormous. We've also introduced paid cultural leave, public holiday swapping, that sort of thing, as appropriate as well. And then I just really encourage, we've redesigned a lot of our websites to ensure that we speak directly to the communities that we're after. So, for example, there is a dedicated LGBTQ page where, even though, and a flyer that goes along with that. So if you are a LGBTQ candidate or even a customer, you can actually see everything that we offer to you. So it's really around, all it is a repackaging up of all of our current policies, our offerings, etc. But it actually goes, this applies to you too. If in case there's any doubt, this applies to you. And so we actually do a kind of get really targeted on some of those pieces as well. Access free leader guidelines wherever you can. So from Anti-Discrimination Commission, from things like QCOS, and obviously from paid memberships as well. But access what you can, contact them, see how you can repurpose it, and really kind of drive those throughout your organisation. They're some of the really kind of, even for an organisation of us of 16,000 people, they're the sorts of things that we have really done to ensure that we're accessing whatever we can on a shoestring sometimes.
Amazing.
Hope
Thank
that
you so
helps.
much. Yeah, that's really fantastic overview, Ryan. Thank you so much. And I really like how you've started with, it said how you started really simply, and it was, around that symbolism. And the thing that really stood out to me was that acknowledgement from the CEO that you spoke about. I think that's super powerful because, again, it's showing that leadership is committed to it as well. And I think that's super powerful. Thank you so much. So Susie, I'm going to go on to you now. So Westpac Group have received recognition through awards for their approach to inclusion and diversity. And one of the key elements that stands out in your strategy is that all employees, so from team members to the executive team, play a role in enabling a culture that values diversity and includes everyone. So I'm really curious about Westpac's journey in this space. So what are some of those key diversity and inclusion principles that Westpac has implemented that ultimately got Westpac to where they are today?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I will acknowledge I'm here on beautiful Arikea country in the Northern Territory and pay my respects to the elders and thank them for their custodianship of the lands here. I also want to just call out a really heartfelt thanks to the services that you all provide to community in Queensland. I think it's an incredible role that you play for the Australian public. So I just want to say heartfelt thanks for that. Just a quick background, I'm not a HR practitioner and I'm acutely aware of the fact that all of you in the audience may or may not have DEI backgrounds, and so I don't. So I'm going to speak to you from a view of not having that DEI background, but I also know that some of you are doing this work off the side of a desk as an extra, role in your already very busy role. So I think today I just want to start with giving you some principles around how we went about it, and just rather than solve just the principles of what I did when I came in 18 months ago into the group's DEI strategy. I've been a people leader for 30 years and have been heavily involved in leadership, mentoring, coaching, and just thought that this might be a nice move to try and make some changes within the group. So the DEI strategy when I took over was not ideal. It was demographically dimensional. So we only had 3 key pillars: women or gender, Indigenous representation, and cultural diversity and leadership. If you look at that as an employee in 50,000 employees, it doesn't look very inclusive. So we absolutely flip that to put employees at the centre. Now, the strategy comes over how you might listen and what you might be hearing from your employees. You can't develop a strategy unless you know sort of your data points. And I guess Lisa and Christine spoke to that quite well this morning around what is my self-assessment of the organisation. But I would also add the self-assessment needs some really deep listening. And Ryan talked about the focus groups and being really broad around that. So one of my key principles, which is an historical principle for Westpac, is listening to our people and finding out from them exactly what their experience is in the group, who they are and why they work at Westpac. So we did some deep reflection, and the first one was we were called Inclusion and Diversity. And the first move we made was diversity, equity and inclusion. And as I said, placed our employees at the centre of our strategy. But in terms of understanding that deep listening piece, we sort of had multiple areas. So we had the focus groups. We have 50,000 employees. And you might think I have a large team and a large budget. My team consists of 2 very deep set subject matter experts, 1 project lead and myself. So a large organisation. So we're heavily reliant on the strategy being right for all employees. And so the first and the biggest principle is listening and deep listening. So focus groups, getting in the divisional differential. You all might have little divisions or little business units or lines of business, making sure that you understand that there's often a different lens in those divisions or lines of business. So making sure that you get a cross-reference of those divisions or lines of business. Make sure that you've got some really deep data from your human resources, whether that's data around demographic or whether that's data around retention, attrition, why people might leave, what's the reasons and experiences that they might have left, or why they've actually joined the organisation as well. And so making sure that you've got some really strong narrative around that data. We also undertake a DEI survey. We're in year 3. Previously, it's been incorporated in the Voice Plus, or, you know, we used to have 1 or 2 sort of questions in Voice Plus. We developed a really strong survey which allowed us not only to look at individuals' demographics with, you know, major consent, obviously, privacy consent from them, and how we store that's really important. But equally, we ask questions around lived experience outside of work. So not just the organisational factors, but, you know, are you a carer? Are you a carer for someone other than children? You know, do you have elder care responsibilities or elderly care responsibilities? Do you live or care for someone living with an injury, illness, or disability? Do you speak different languages at home? So we ask a raft of questions, which also helps us determine those hardwiring things that need to change. So we all talk about policies, and Ryan talked about making sure that your policies reflect, you know, your workforce. Well, we call that the hardwiring. So the policies being hardwired, and so making sure that the collection of your information, that it's used in a way that supports those individuals going forward. So whatever that might look like. So surveys, we do monitor participation levels in surveys. So if you're running your own survey, making sure that year on year you're getting better participation, and that you're also looking at those that prefer not to respond in that. So while you're doing your audit, assessment, and getting that data, making sure that it's not a huge portion of people, because that's sort of sending you a message around the confidence and trust that they have in you collecting your information. And then obviously when we look at that, that's all internal. We also look at the intersectional approach, so the demographic intersectionality. We also look at the external market, not just domestic but global, and the trends that are coming in terms of both workforce productivity and DEI. So that's some of the principles we started with. So deep listening, making sure that that listening informs your strategy, not vice versa. Like, we really want to go after that because it's a quick win, but actually, will that meet the needs of your employees, and will that actually serve you to be an organisation where people can see themselves, and that you're serving the community in which you're dedicated to. So I think that's in terms of principles. I think, Sarah, that's where I would stop. So deep listening, and then making sure that you've got both hardwiring, which is policies and processes, and then the soft wiring, which is the initiatives. I think Ryan talked to really well, which was some of those things that we can do in the workplace. So very mindful of time, but that's just a quick and dirty around, you know, the way in which we've approached principle of listening.
Thank you so much, Susie. And yeah, I feel like we could all talk about these things all day, but mindful that people online probably can't spend all day talking about, unfortunately. But yeah, this has been really interesting. And I really like that you spoke about those principles, because no matter how large or small the organization is, those principles you know, are useful for all different sized organizations. And the deep listening is really significant, and something that Lisa and Christine also spoke to as well. So thank you so much for sharing that and your journey with those strategies. So Jed, I'll move over to you now. So Jed, diversity and inclusion is at the heart of Gold Coast Health's Always Care philosophy, and it's seen as a really critical part of delivering healthcare services and a work environment that is safe and inclusive for everyone. So are you able to give a bit of an overview of Gold Coast Health's diversity and inclusion strategy, and share how incorporating the lived experience of diverse individuals has influenced its approach?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And can I just acknowledge the people out there that are listening that are just on the start of their D&I journey, or it may be on the side of the portfolio where I think a lot of D&I stuff starts, and that this might feel really overwhelming. Please, what I hope as well is to message is just to take a step back as well, and that it's okay to start somewhere, little. But our diversity and inclusion strategy at Gold Coast Health, this is the second strategy that we've had, and so this one is a lot more, I suppose, in depth and informed by the lived experience of our workforce, and we're really proud of that. And that, I suppose, has been an evolution over the last 6 or 7 years. And so the design included really extensive consultation with our workforce broadly, but also included our employee networks. So we have employee networks for our women, our Rainbow Alliance networks, LGBTIQ+, our multicultural network, our All Abilities network in the disability space, and we also have a really active veterans network. So those are the pillars within our diversity inclusion strategy, as well as life stages, which is really important in the healthcare setting in regards to what it looks like for our young people entering, and then also what that transition to retirement looks like. We've got a huge nursing cohort that was trained very differently to what they're trained now, and it's really important that we transfer that wisdom. So looking at strategies like that. As well as our gender equality action plan, and also wellbeing. So alongside our strategy, we have action plans for all of those pillars. So we really empowered our networks to be bold in that and to tell us what was really important to them and relevant to our organisation. I think one of the biggest risks is when you're designing something, and it's already sort of been spoken about, is that you can design a sort of big solution, but it may not be relevant to your organisation. And so the listening to the experience is really important. And we also looked for what the consistent themes were. So what can you do that is going to be relevant for a lot of our diverse groups? And two of the things that came up in that space was the need for inclusive mentorship, or even more simply a buddy program, and really just around those relationship building at the start, which can be challenging in big organisations, and I would imagine even more challenging in smaller. And also the need to build the capability of our workforce. We've got a very busy workforce. You only have to look at the media to understand that public health care has never been under so much pressure before. And so being able to prioritise this work, it can be challenging. So our strategy focuses on 6 core areas. So it looks at the diversity within the workforce, and we're really clear that it's not only about responding to the Public Sector Commission targets around who we employ, but it's really important to us that we make sure that our workforce represents the community so that we can serve the community well. Fostering a culture of belonging to ensure that people feel valued, respected, heard and seen. Strengthening leadership accountability in delivering the strategy. If I can say one thing that you remember is that you won't be able to do this alone, and so finding your leaders is really important. Increase staff capability, training and awareness. Review and update systems, processes and policies to promote that culture of equal opportunity and free from bias and discrimination, and promote a safe and healthy work environment that prioritises the mental health of the workforce. So some of the exciting things that came out when we went through the design process of the 2023 to 2025 strategy was the need to respond to menopause in our organisation. And so that was quite surprising, but it came up really clearly. And so we've partnered with one of the universities to again, understand what that looks like in our organisation and how we need to respond to it, instead of implementing a sweeping sort of solution that may not work for us as a health organisation. We've also, it was also established that we really need to look at what the return to work for our parents looks like. And so we've put a lot of effort into even our facilities, our policies and those side of things. We participated in the Australian Workplace Equality Index. They're really great benchmarking activities that you can engage in that tells you, they guide you what best practice is. And that was really important to our Rainbow Alliance network. They wanted to be proud of organisation. They wanted for us to really get involved in that. One of the other things that we did was partner with Randstad and Get Skilled Access, which is an organisation founded by Dylan Alcott. And that process really involved us not only employing people with disability, but making sure that our processes, policies and the way that we did business was inclusive to keep our people with disability as well. And so we did learn a lot about that. And one of the big bodies of work that's come out of that is reasonable adjustment, and how we manage the reasonable adjustment process in our at Gold Coast Health. And it also told us that we need to start to consider what a refugee and migrant employment pathway will look like, and to prioritise that. And that's something that we're going to embark on this year. And again, I would encourage you to be clear in what you can commit, and it's okay to have, I suppose, boundaries in your timelines to that. So we haven't embarked on that body of work quite yet, because we just don't have the capacity to do it, and we want to make sure that when we do it well. And so being able to have those clear timelines in your strategy and action plans, I think, is important. One of my favourite parts of doing this work is getting out there and talking to it and challenging it. And one of my favourite conversations that our strategy has allowed us to do this year is to speak at one of our staff forums around that difference that was talked around earlier, around equity and equality, and having that conversation around that it's okay, and more than okay, it's required to treat people differently. And that can be really challenging for people. And so being able to lean into that conversation doesn't have to be a big scale forum, but can be more smaller scale, and empowering your leaders to have those conversations. I anticipate we're not going to get to the second question because of timing. So again, I just want to go back and just start somewhere. I think those smaller scale events and those sort of things can feel tokenistic, but a lot of this work starts there, and it evolves into something bigger. I'll talk more about that if I get the chance, but I'll also note that our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Nations response doesn't sit within our diversity and inclusion team here, because we have its own function in the Cultural Capability and Indigenous Health Unit here. So that work is done by them in our organisation, and we partner strongly with them.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jed. That was a really great overview. I think one of the things that stood out to me was that you can't do it alone, what you just said. And I think that's the key theme that's coming through the conversation here today, is that you really need commitment from everyone, leadership, all employees. Yeah, you really need to kind of work together to achieve this. So thank you so much for sharing that journey.
Thank you.
Karen, I'll move over to you now. So Desbit have developed, or are in the process of developing, a cultural capability resource for non-Indigenous organisations to assist them to build culturally safe workplaces and to attract and retain Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers. Are you able to provide some advice on what organisations can do to build their cultural capability?
Yes, thanks, Sarah, and thanks for having me on. Just a quick acknowledgement of the traditional owners of Meanjin, where I'm dialing in from, and really passionate about this topic. So I'm very excited to announce that we've just released the Cultural Capability Resource, which is something we've been doing under the First Nations training strategy, and it's available on our Business Queensland website. So I might enter that webpage in after this. So anyway, the resource, while it is under the First Nations space, I think this can be applied to any community group and cohort. It's also focused on small businesses, but again, I think any org can pick this up and apply it. There's really great detail in there to help every org plan for this space. So in response to the question, I think the first step is around building knowledge and education. So know what country you're on, what your business, how your business and org is operating, who are the traditional owners and the community groups within that area. Understand, and this is really important, understand cultural history and the sensitivities of the communities that you're working with. So values, traditions, protocols. Some practical steps include an acknowledgement of country on your website, include them in meetings in your office. The other really important thing for orgs to address and really get on top of is racism and unconscious bias in the workplace. So consider things like stereotypes, preconceptions. Is tokenism a problem? uninformed assumptions about cultural commitments and culture in general. Is there a lack of role models in the workplace that's contributing to that kind of behaviour? So what can orgs and businesses do, like practical steps? Well, obviously, and all the speakers before have spoken at length about policies. This is really where you start, because this is how you lead by example. Clear policies set the tone for staff and ensure that they know what is acceptable and what is not. It's really important that in a First Nations space and any cultural space that you engage content experts. So if you're developing policies around your Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workforce, engage First Nations experts. So policies, for instance, codes of conduct, anti-discrimination, obviously a reconciliation action plan, and even things like culturally sensitive grievance and complaints procedures are really important to ensure that not just your Indigenous staff, but your non-Indigenous staff are aware of how your business will operate. This can all contribute to creating that cultural awareness and cultural safety. Education and training, there is so much training out there. There's quite a lot of free resources that you can tap into, micro-credentials for your staff and your leaders, but also resources on websites. Or if your budget allows, get an expert in and do some really tailored training for your business, your staff, and the community that you work in and are based in. Diverse hiring and promotions, that's really critical, and I know it was touched on previously by Christine and Lisa. Transparency in decision making and policy implementation is critical. Through transparency, you build trust. Think about diversity and inclusion committees. I know that Ryan was talking really about what they're doing in Uniting Care. It's really great to have these committees because they don't just kind of show that you respect the voices of your diverse workforce, but they are also making sure that your organisation is on track in terms of building that culturally safe workplace. Put in place mentoring, sponsorship programs, evaluate, monitor constantly. Your aim is improvement. And probably top of the list is, again, leaders should be setting the example. Make sure your leaders are doing that properly. And if they're not, they need to be pulled into line, for lack of a, to say it roughly. And look, the benefits, again, I just quickly, Christine, Lisa said this, much more eloquently than me. Greater employee engagement and cohesion. That sense of belonging and teamwork is gold. It builds productivity, it improves staff attendance, and also importantly for not just orgs but businesses, it enhances customer relationships. Just quickly looking at recruitment and selection practices, your job ads, think of language, make sure that it's inclusive, that language. Where are your jobs advertised? Consider First Nations platforms like Koori Mail, community social media pages, your interviewing and assessment processes. Be conscious of cultural differences in communication styles. Include a First Nations person on the panel where you can, and at the very least, panel members should have gone through cultural awareness training. And don't forget onboarding. Onboarding is important because you don't want to just attract them, you want to retain a diverse workforce. And that means making sure the onboarding process is welcoming, that they're well orientated with what the workplace is and what you do. Provide a mentor. That mentoring support is really important to help them navigate the social structures within an organisation. Connect them to other First Nations staff and communities, and encourage questioning and feedback in a way that they feel comfortable to access. And then probably just conscious of time, the other big things, understand and recognise cultural load. So the weight and burden of cultural identity and the historical and ongoing impacts of oppression that some First Nations people feel is important to understand that. And be aware and don't add to that burden. So always expecting that your First Nation staff will do the welcome to country or acknowledgement of country can add to that cultural load. And communication and engagement across the business will help in understand that and understand the cultural space that you're working in. So that doesn't just include your workplace, it includes your customers, your supply chain. So for instance, actively seek out to engage First Nations businesses in your supply chain, develop those partnerships and collaborations, set procurement targets, and make cultural awareness training available to your subcontractors and partners. And importantly, always engage with your community and get that steer from them, because they will really help you on this journey of building a culturally safe workplace. So that's a very quick overview. I encourage everyone to get online on Business Queensland, have a look at the cultural capability resource. It goes into a lot of detail, and then we can also provide links to training options.
Thank you so much for that overview, Karen. That's really, really exciting to see that, to hear that it's finally been released. And I think it's going to be a really useful tool for so many organisations. So thanks for providing that overview.
No problems, happy.
Annette, I will move on to you now. And I'm really curious to hear about some achievable steps that organisations can take when it comes to building a culture of inclusion and belonging. Obviously, for many organisations, they have a limited budget when it comes to HR and implementing initiatives. So yeah, very interested to hear about some of those achievable things organisations can do.
Thank you, and also like to acknowledge that I'm on Turrbal and Yagara lands and pay respects to Elders past, present and emerging. We are a small organisation, so we have on average somewhere between 26 and 30 employees. And I think similar to what I've heard today, QCOS is probably, I guess DIB started out probably organically as well and became very purposeful. So for example, we also have a reconciliation action plan, and we've just had that approved by Reconciliation Australia. And similar to what was spoken about by Desbert, is that we did a cultural capability review last year, and that really informed a lot of the content that's gone into our reconciliation action plan. And it also aligns to, we put in place an HR strategy probably just over 2 years ago, and just currently drafting the next one, where we were really explicit around that commitment to diversity. And I think the commitment from the top for us starts with our board. And our board has been very clear on the expectations around that commitment as an organisation, which then comes into, I guess, the management and the leadership team. Not dissimilar to other things that I've heard today, and Ryan has also spoken to them. We are a small organisation. We did do our EBA review last year, and we're really mindful about ensuring that the language that was used throughout the EBA was appropriate. That doesn't cost anything. That's just a commitment to ensure that your language is appropriate. Our EBA talks to a lot around flexible work practices. We've also included gender affirmation leave. We also have additional family and community services leave for employees to tap into to help them manage some of the family and other commitments that they have outside the workplace. We've enhanced our compassionate leave provisions. We've also looked at our parental leave provisions and included and been really explicit about kinship and foster care arrangements. As an organisation, we've always made available domestic and family violence leave, paid leave at 10 days. So kind of feel like the rest of the world's caught up, which is fabulous. Our policies as well, we've been really explicit about what those, I guess, I like the framing around the kind of the hardwiring pieces, but we've included things around, you know, wellness and how we develop wellness plans to support the individual needs of our employees. Our EBA speaks really strongly to anti-discrimination and wellbeing in our workplace. I think the other thing too, the recruitment and the onboarding is absolutely critical, and we made a big commitment a couple of years ago to the onboarding, and our onboarding starts before someone even walks through the door. and to ensure that by the time they come into the organisation, that they have a good understanding of who we are and the employees within our organisation. We've got a range of online resources and tools that they tap into, so they have a good understanding around expected behaviours and who we are. And so usually when they walk into the organisation, they kind of have a good understanding of the individuals they're going to work with in our organisation and its approach. Our recruitment practices, one of the things that we do that's quite simple is we actually provide every candidate with the interviews prior to their interview, and that ensures that really acknowledges that people consume information and respond to question and content quite differently. So people have an opportunity to have those questions and reflect, and that's worked really, really well for us. I think we have exceptional HR practice in the organisation. We ensure that everyone has access to the same opportunities and professional development. The other thing, we certainly we have our management and leadership have team charters, and that's really explicit around the expected behaviours, and how we show up actually really matters, and that we act with integrity. We lead by example, so that's something that is quite a visual demonstration around the commitment that we've made in our organisation. Inclusivity is core to our values. I think one of the other things, because I know I've got about 2 minutes. I heard someone mention Gallup before. So again, that monitoring, that evaluation of everything that we do, and there's a lot. We actually do an annual employee engagement survey, and that's underpinned by the Gallup 12, which is the questions, and that helps to understand that kind of engagement and sense of belonging in our workplace. They've actually just added additional questions into that Gallup survey, which is around respect, and I heard respect spoken to before, and that's about that at work, that I'm treated with respect, and that my organisation also cares about my overall well-being. So we'll be looking at how we can bring that in, but we do that each year. It gives us a good kind of checkpoint about where we're at as an organisation, and then staff are also provided with that detail and have the opportunity to reflect on where we are and where we might need to do things a bit differently. We've also used partnerships to deliver in-house training to kind of ensure that we're across the different needs of the individuals in our organisations, and we've done a couple of years ago LGBTQI, use of gender pronouns, what that actually means in a workspace. How do we create safe workspaces? We've done work around what does it mean when you're working with or engaging with people that identify as being neurodiverse. These aren't things that come at a significant cost to our organisation. We tend to leverage the partnerships and the expertise that we know is within our organisation, but external to our organisation as well. So it's as diverse as the people that we'd like to engage in our workspace. I think the areas for QCOS that we are looking at applying more focus is particularly around the recruitment and the retention of First Nations employees, and employees also that would identify as having a disability. But there is a lot you can do as a small organisation that doesn't necessarily come with large price tags. It just requires a willingness and a commitment by everyone in the organisation to step up to that.
Thank you so much for that, Annette.
Perfect timing, 11:30 on the dot.
I'm really wishing we had more time.
I know, I have got pages of content. So if anyone wants to talk to me after that, you know where I live. I'm here at QCOS, and I think I do live here. So not hard to find.
That's right. Thank you so much, Annette. I'm mindful that we've come to time, but Christine, I just wanted to quickly go back to you and just see if you felt there's anything you wanted to add to the conversation in terms of some of the strategies organisations can put in place to support employees from a culturally and linguistically diverse background. I'm hoping in future sessions we'll touch on it a lot more, but I just wanted to see if there's anything you wanted to add to the conversation.
Thank you, Sarah. Just in a quick couple of minutes, I think one of the challenges that you have with employees from culturally and linguistically diverse background is usually when the word culture is incorporated, it does exclude them a lot in Australian context, because culture is usually, if there's a cultural capability framework or cultural capability strategy that an organisation has, it usually has a heavy focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and there usually isn't anything specific that is developed for cold communities, or if it is, it's more or less tokenistic. And because of the diversity of that pool, it tends to focus on probably more humanitarian cohorts than looking at the broader skilled migrant cohorts, which also form a large part of the workforce in the community services sector. There also isn't a lot of growth in terms of culturally and linguistically diverse workers transcending from that frontline worker population, where they are really largely overrepresented. They're very much underrepresented in leadership. Deloitte did a survey that was funded by the Department of Multicultural Affairs that looked at 1 in 4 migrant workers which are employed in the sector were underemployed. Language was not found to be as big of a barrier as anecdotally thought. The average migrant is a female worker in her mid-30s who has a commerce degree and an MBA, skills which I'm sure in your organizations you can use, but because of the lack of Australian experience that a person may have in those skills are usually not taken into account when they're interviewed for jobs, and that means a lot of them remain in that frontliner worker force, which a lot of them use as a migration pathway, but organizations are not really harnessing those skills that migrants bring into the community. Let me not even get into the overrepresentation of health workforce in Uber driving and other sectors where their skills are being underutilized when this sector could be utilizing them in a different capacity. The other thing that came up in the work that Deloitte did was racial profiling does exist. It's not a comfortable conversation. It's not a conversation that we're wanting to have, but it is a reality. And that was what a lot of migrants who were interviewed actually gave back in their feedback. They felt they were discriminated against, how their name sounded, how they looked, and where they came from when it came to opportunities for employment and specifically opportunities for advancement. If you're getting into a leadership role, you become the face of the organization. And if you look across leadership across all Australian organizations, even in organizations where you expect to see people of color in leadership positions, they're just not represented. The Human Rights Commission does a leading change report and has looked across the public sector, the private sector, and the community services sector. And even though 1 in 4 Australians come from multicultural backgrounds, there's less than 0.3% that are in a leadership role, and we're talking about the C-suite level. There's also inherent bias that is built into merit selection process, which automatically excludes people of color and the qualifications that they have, particularly coming from different countries. And I've mentioned that before. And I think when we start to acknowledge some of these uncomfortable truths and have some conversations around them internally about why there is such poor representation when we look across skilled migrant workforce being one of the fastest population groups that are growing in Australia, why there is still such limited representation in leadership and in the decision-making tables that can actually move the dial around policies being more inclusive. It's hard to make inclusive policies if the people that you need to make inclusive policies for are still poorly represented across the decision-making table. And we will touch a lot more on these in later chapters, but I'm conscious we're out of time.
Thank you so much, Christine. Yeah, that was a really good way of finishing, and there's a lot of food for thought there, and definitely something we'll be delving into as the sessions go on. So thank you for that. So I just want to finish off by saying a really big thank you to all of our wonderful panelists and speakers. So thank you, Lisa and Christine, for your presentation, and thank you so much to our panelists, Ryan, Susie, Karen, Jed, and Annette, for sharing your insights on the topic. It's just so valuable to hear so many different, experiences and perspectives when it comes to this topic. So really appreciate you being here. And I just want to finish off by saying there'll be an evaluation poll that will pop up on the screen shortly. So if you can please fill that in, that would be much appreciated. And as we mentioned before, you will receive a copy of the slides from today's presentation in a post-event email. And we'll also be sending you some resources in the email as well. So we've got a Supporting Diverse Workforces webpage on the QCOS website, and there's already quite a lot of resources and templates, and also some on-demand webinars that you can watch on that page as well. So please utilise and access that page. And as you would have seen on the screen before, we do have our next session coming up in March. And that session will be on the topic of writing a job ad that gets hits. So that's on the 26th of March. And we look forward to seeing you back for that one. So thank you everyone for joining us today. And thank you again to our speakers and panelists.